Okay. Cool. Then I will be starting my time now. My partner and I affirm the resolution that U.S. states should ban police unions from endorsing and from giving campaign contributions to political candidates. So now for some resolutional analysis. We believe that the word should in the resolution indicates a call to action and therefore implies that this is a policy round, which should then therefore be weighed through a net benefits paradigm, meaning that the team that does the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people should win today's round. For the definition of terms, we believe that all of these terms are contextual, but I will kind of get into background on police unions in the inherency, which brings me to the inherency. The inherency is kind of what we see in the status quo and what we've seen historically surrounding police reform and unions. So what we see in the status quo, as I'm sure we all know, is that there is clear dysfunction in police departments in the criminal justice system across the board. We know that this is an extremely racist and violent system in the status quo. We see that people of color are killed at higher rates by police officers, more likely to be arrested for nonviolent offenses. Their communities are over-policed. We also know that cops are often not charged with like any of the crimes that they commit. An example of this is domestic violence. 40% of families where the patriarch is a cop face domestic violence and see no convictions. So basically, this all boils down to a question: why is there no reform? We believe that police unions and their campaign contributions to political candidates are actually a big reason for why we are unable to see the passing of meaningful police reform across the board. So kind of for some background on police unions, we see that the union push in police departments was one after a wave of civil disobedience in Baltimore, San Francisco, and New York, and other cities where police used protesting tactics and were basically able to unionize by the early 70s. Since the early 70s, we've seen like a drastic decrease in the general lack of like the frequency of passage of police reforms as compared to the 60s. And we believe that a lot of this is directly due to the presence of these police unions that are able to play such a large role in the political system, which brings us to the plan. The plan is that all 50 US states should ban police union reforms from endorsing and from giving campaign contributions to political candidates. The actor is, of course, the 50 states as indicated by the resolution. The time frame is as soon as possible, and the method of implementation is normal ways and means. So our advantage is that of police reform. The first uniqueness here is that, as we know right now, tensions are extremely high in the status quo surrounding police reform. We are seeing far more attention in the media since the death of George Floyd, and we are all overall seeing far greater cries for police reform recently. So following the murder of George Floyd in May and the murder of Breonna Taylor, mass protests have broken out all across the United States and ushered in a wave of new calls for police reform. And there have been 450 policing reform bills introduced at the state level since the murder of George Floyd, meaning that right now is a uniquely key time frame to pass the plan, because many of these bills will be decided in the months following this election, but many more will likely be in state and local legislatures for years to come surrounding this new wave for police reform, meaning that state and local elections next year will also be uniquely important. The second uniqueness is that state and local elections occur every single year, which means that these elections occur far more frequently and play a very important role. I will take your question at the end of the advantage.
That was Governor Gavin.
Oh, I'm sorry, is that me?
Racial inequality.
Sorry. My apologies. Okay. Anyways, like I was saying, we see that state and local elections occur every single year. And what we see is what this means, that the sheer number of bills that state and local legislatures have over police reforms is far greater than what we see at a federal level, meaning that state and local legislatures are uniquely key for enacting police reforms. So the links. The link is that the plan passes and police unions can't endorse or give contributions to political candidates. This is on a local and statewide and therefore national level. What we see is that banning campaign contributions means that politicians do not feel as much pressure to pass legislation based upon the interests of police unions. We see right now that unions are actually able to donate a lot of money to political candidates, and this not only directly helps the candidates get elected just because of the amount of like ads and campaigning that they can do as a result of the donation, but it also makes these candidates beholden to these police unions and the demands of the police unions, because their re-election is now contingent based upon the desires of these unions. When we remove of police unions and their ability to actually put money in the pockets of these politicians, we see that these politicians no longer need to fear the ways that police unions are actually going to be able to, like sway their reelection in coming years, meaning that we remove the influence of these police unions. Candidates will not feel as much pressure to listen to police unions before their constituents because they no longer feel like they need to get this funding from police unions to get reelected. We can look to California, where policymakers did not pass a bill to require the police to document the loss of firearms simply because the police unions that help fund their campaigns opposed it. Obviously, it's a pretty intuitive bill that police should be able to require if they are losing their firearms or misplacing them. But the police unions were against that, and the police unions funded all the candidates that voted against the bill. So the internal links. The first internal link is a very specific one. What we see right now is a call for necessary reforms for body cameras. Subpoint A here is that half of officers say that wearing body cameras would make officers more likely to act appropriately when dealing with the public. We see a lot of the time police officers get away with the heinous crimes that they commit as a result of being able to find loopholes in body camera laws, or claim that their body cameras did not work or simply weren't turned on. And we see right now that there are a bunch of bills in state and local legislatures across the United States calling for the loopholes when it comes to police body camera usage to be closed right now. The earliest studies conducted indicated that body-worn cameras resulted in positive interactions between officers and citizens and made people feel safer. Reductions in citizen complaints were noted, as were similar reductions in crime. We see that overall police reform is good for decreasing the amount of crime that we see in communities across the board. So the second internal link is that there are necessary reforms currently that could be affected by the passage of the plan for warrants of the use of force. A study on 100 police departments found that police departments with policies that place clear restrictions on when and how officers use force had significantly fewer killings than those that did not have the same restrictions in place. What's really unique about the plan passing right now, right before the 2020 election, is that we can solve for the 450 bills and the bills that will be coming in the following months that will be in the state and local legislatures for years to come, and therefore we can hold the police accountable. Vote F.
Okay, my order is going to be first counterplan, 2 disads, and then affirmation casing. My time starts now. Hi, my name is Selena Song. I'll be the first negation speaker for today's topic. First, let's start with the negation's counterplan. Our counterplan is that the United States federal government should ban police unions from endorsing and from giving campaign contributions to political candidates. The agent of actor and enforcer is going to be the United States federal government. Time frame is the same as theirs, as soon as possible, and funding is the same as theirs, always in need. So let's go on to why this plan is mutually exclusive. Number one is that we have a different actor, and we're going to be telling you with our advantages why the 50 states doing this isn't good and why the federal government is uniquely to solving for the problem. Number two, there's no way the act can have both the United States federal government enact this and the states enact this. Number three is that according to the 10th Amendment rights, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states. We're seeing that these powers can only be reserved for either the U.S. federal government or the states, and not both. Okay, now moving on to why we compete on net benefits. We're going to be competing on the unique reasons as to why the U.S. federal government is a better actor than the states. And I'll start with my first contention, which is lack of supervision. So let's look to the uniqueness of what is happening in the status quo right now. We see that in 2010, in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court held that corporate funding of independent political broadcasts in candidate elections cannot be limited because doing so would violate the First Amendment. So this was in the Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission case. So we see that there has been a federal precedent of not limiting any corporate funding. So we need a federal precedent to overturn that case, and need to use the US federal government instead of the 50 states to actually overturn that precedent. Number two is that we see that the federal government is actually better for investment to enforce this plan rather than the state's government is. We can look to the fact that following the 2008 recession, the Obama administration increased spending on roads and transit projects despite a decline in federal fuel tax revenues, because it was able to use its power power of deficit spending, an authority that state and local governments do not have. So because this plan, it needs to be like enforced well, the federal government's investment backing and its ability to deficit spend is going to be better to actually enforce this plan. So moving on to the reasons to prefer our plan. Number one is that federal action is the only sustainable method, and it acts as a prerequisite to any kind of state action. So it looks at the fact that we need some kind of federal precedent to make sure that it's consistent between all the states and to overturn that Supreme Court case that has been set in 2010. Number two is that federal level action is really important because they control the Federal Election Commission, which is what was used in the Supreme Court case. So that's really important to make sure that all of these states are consistent as well. And so onto the impacts, we absorb basically all of the affirmation impacts on better police reform, but make it even more effective because of the federal government's investment backing. Okay, now moving on to my second contention, which is state partisanship. So we see that there's already a strife conflict between different states due to the election, and partisanship and polarization is higher than ever. We can look to the fact that the affirmation case clearly states that tensions are already really high between the states, and it's a really controversial topic of police brutality. We see that if the United States presents a united front by all mandating this with the federal government, there's an equal assurance that all states will be able to access the plan actually passing. But we see that in the affirmation world, because different states may lean like Democratic or Republican, there's a lot of polarization. They can't guarantee that there's not going to be like states that find loopholes with this plan passing, or states that are going to be super biased or maybe skewed. So it's not going to be ineffective in the affirmation world. Moving on to the reasons to prefer our plan. Number one is that when we enact this at the federal level, we're going to be uniting states more. And when we like decrease polarization and make sure that the states present a united front, we're also going to be decreasing polarization. And then that leads to more policies supported both passed in the Senate. Secondly, this helps U.S. perception by taking a stance on this prevalent issue of police brutality. So when we enact this at a federal level, it's a really good perception to other countries as well that we're taking a stance on like discrimination of people of color and like discrimination because of police brutality, which is really good for U.S. hegemony and soft power in the long term as well. So moving on to the impacts, we see that more policies are going to be passed because of this unity. We see that the 450 bills that they talk about being introduced at the state level, those can also be passed, which means we're going to have like long-term effects on policies and be able to like decrease domestic violence, decrease police brutality in the long term, which means we access the higher magnitude impacts in today's round. And in addition, by increasing U.S. hegemony and helping U.S. perception, we're also going to be, because of our soft power, we're going to be having more negotiation power in like trade negotiations in the global community, and as well as like any intervention in other countries as well by having even more soft power in U.S. hegemony. So moving on into their affirmation contention. So on their first contention about police reform and tensions being really high, they talk about how 450 bills are introduced at the state level. We actually turn this contention against them because we absorb all of their advantages and their impacts about actually enacting police reform, because we're also banning police unions from endorsing and giving campaign contributions, but we're uniquely solving better because we are increasing state unity by our second advantage of like state polarization. So we see that these 450 bills have a higher probability of being passed in the engaged world, where we have more state unity and they're able to like pass more policies and beneficial policies in the long term there. This review also applies to their second intention about reform for body cameras, because there's more necessary reform that is being passed as well. In addition, we can look at the fact that precedent is really key to solving, because a lack of local level oversight is literally the reason that so many local level areas don't have a check back for abuse. Like local level oversight is one of the reasons why like police brutality is happening, because some of the reports of like police brutality aren't going through and aren't enacted upon, which is why federal action is the only sustainable method, and is important to maintain like consistency between these states as well. So for all these reasons and many more, I strongly urge a vote for the negation side of today.
Can I interject really quick before you start? I'm sorry. I think, Selena, when you're speaking down, sometimes we can't hear all the words that are coming out of your mouth. Okay, so I just want to tell you that before you get into your next speech.
Oh, is there anything you want me to repeat, or like my internet cut out or something?
No, I think just when you put your head down, sometimes I think your voice is not projecting toward the mic, so we're not hearing. I'm not. I don't know if the other judges are having the same problem. Okay.
Yeah, I had the same problem. I think it's when you're turning away to the side, you're looking at your notes or something. If you're facing full on the camera, I hear you fine, but when you're turning away, you're not apparently directing your voice towards your mic, and it's hard to hear.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind in my next speech. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, just as an order, so we're all on the same page, I'm going to go over the negations case in the order that they read it, and then the affirmations contention. All right, I'll be starting my time now. My partner and I remain in the strongest affirmation of the resolution. Our overview to today's round is that the counterplan is always going to be less effective and cause higher backlash than the affirmative plan, so it's a clear vote for the aff. So let's talk about the counterplan. The plan is better for 4 reasons. First, we can see that state and local level enforcement will always be better. We know this to be true because obviously these local enforcements are more reliable than the federal government trying to understand what is going wrong in every single district, every city, every county, every state. State governments are better at enforcing these things because it's on a smaller level. So they are able to enforce it in unique ways that are able to actually work in their communities. They're more familiar with their communities. The second reason the affirmation plan is better is because the 50 states have higher approval ratings individually than the federal government. We can see that 58% of people have a positive view of their state government, whereas only 28% of people have a positive view of the federal government. This isn't even just in like the context of the Trump administration. This is a constant level, a relatively constant level of approval ratings. What that means is that there will be less backlash against this if passed on a state level because people trust their state governments more. Additionally, we can see that state and local laws get repealed or don't get repealed as often as federal laws do. Federal laws get it's a higher probability that this ban would get repealed on a federal level than every single of the state would repeal it. This is essentially true because we know that the laws won't get repealed on a state level because so many states actually support this. But if it's on a federal level, it will be much easier to overturn this ban, which means that the impacts of the plan won't last for nearly as long. The fourth reason is that we can see that on a federal level, there will be more backlash. This is because it will get significantly more media attention. If you just simply think about the media that you consume, it's pretty likely that a lot of what you're reading about only pertains to the federal level legislation or maybe just your state. However, when we see it on a federal level, like federal level media, what we're going to see is higher rates of backlash, specifically coming from violent white supremacist groups. This means that this independently outweighs all of the impacts they offer you because we see more violence as a result of the counterplan. And lastly, the last issue with their plan is that police departments are not run nationally, which means that this isn't going to be able to solve effectively. They talk about loopholes. That's when these local level police departments are going to be finding loopholes, and it's going to be much easier for this plan to not be effective. That means that they have no offense in today's round because their counterplan is not going to be effectively solving for the impacts that we've isolated throughout the round. On the contention about lack of supervision. First, what they tell you is that the Supreme Court said that they can't limit corporate funding. Unions are not corporations, which means that the issue that they isolate here is just not true. It's not going to happen, and it's not something to vote on. But additionally, what we can see is that we say our plan passes through normal ways of means. This means, I'll take it at the end. This means that the federal government wouldn't try to overturn every state's ruling. What we're going to see is that the federal government is obviously going to have to support it when all 50 states do it. But additionally, what we know is that in debate, the affirmation gets to guarantee that their plan passes. That is how debate works. We have this thing called fiat, which essentially means that we imagine that our plan passes. That means that we fully ban funding for like endorsements and donations for political candidates from these unions. That means that we can 100% guarantee that unions aren't going to be donating thousands, if not more, to these candidates for their election, which means that they're not going to be able to sway their decisions on key reform policies that we've already isolated. On the second contention about polarization, I want you to gut check this. almost every policy that is that is passed on a federal level causes less unity, especially when it's something that we already know the country is divided on. When the federal government passes this policy and we already know they have a roughly 30% lower approval rating from constituents, what we're going to see is less unity. We're going to see more backlash, like I've already isolated on the counterplan, which means that this can't solve. We will see greater unity when this is working on a local and state level. They tell you about loopholes. Again, I want to reiterate that the power of the affirmation is that we get to guarantee that our plan passes. At the point in which we completely ban, it's not just restricting, it's a full ban on endorsements and donations. We can see that we have extremely high probability that we will be able to effectively end all police union donations. Additionally, on the point of unity, what we can see is that if this passes on a federal level, which would mean passing through Congress, Trump will backlash. We know this is true because we know that Trump doesn't support the majority of police reforms being offered right now, which means he definitely isn't going to support mitigating the power of police unions, especially because the largest police union in the country just endorsed him, which means he's definitely going to backlash against this. That means he's going to backlash towards Congress. And what that really means is he's going to rile up Republicans, which it's specifically in Congress. That means he's going to use this in order to make people upset, cause these protests that I've been referring to before. That means that there is more violence, there is more protests. We know that these protests are causing divisions in our country because a lot of white supremacist groups think that like these police reforms aren't necessary. That means that there's more violence. That means that the country will 110% not be united. The affirmations plan has the highest chance of actually uniting the country, which means it's a clean vote for the affirmation because we have access to the impacts of soft power. If all 50 states are effectively passing a policy to decrease the ability for police unions to either support or oppose bills that would regulate them, what we see is that this is going to increase the perception of the US on a global stage, which means that we'll actually be able to have soft power. When other countries see the amount of white supremacist violence occurring in our country right now, they do not think that's impressive. They don't think that that's something that's going to boost our soft power, which means that the affirmations plan has the best probability of boosting our perception on a global stage. So on the advantage, we tell you about all of these state and local elections that are coming up. We tell you how frequent they are, and we tell you about two crucial areas of reform that are on the line right now. They tell you that the counterplan solves better because it has a higher probability of passing. But what we can see is that constituent backlash will be lower on the state level because I've explained this multiple times, which means that people will be less polarized at these local levels, which means that the actual regulations being passed are more likely to be passed under the world of the affirmation because we can see that there's less political polarization because it's happening again on a state level. They tell you about a lack of oversight and how that's causing issues right now. This is happening because there aren't enough regulations. That's why all the violence is occurring, because we're not effectively regulating police. That means that if you believe that the affirmations plan is even 1% more likely to solve or 1% more likely to not cause violence, it's an easy vote for the affirmation because we increase regulations. We ensure that these are passed, which means that we decrease violence through the independent scenarios we give you about both body cams and use of force regulations. This means at the end of the day, you're voting affirmation because the counterplan increases polarization in the country, increases violence, increases protests, and is overall not preferable to the affirmative plan, which means it's a clear vote for the affirmation on the impacts of accountability for police, which is necessary for saving the lives of constituents right now.
Okay, I'm just gonna get my order together. All right, I'm just going to be starting straight off with the negations case on the first argument and the second argument, then going on to the affirmatives case. And yeah, let me know if my Wi-Fi cuts out or if I'm lagging or anything like that. Okay, with that being said, my time starts now. The overview of the first negative contention is that the affirmative effectively just comes up here and hip-hops over our warrants to say what they want to, but they don't actually respond to the facts. Let's start off with the line by line. The first thing that they say here is that state and local level enforcement will always be better because the United States federal government can't be reliable. Let's go to their own case. They tell you that there are 450 bills at the state level that have not been passed yet. Why have these bills not been passed if state level enforcement is so good? But secondly, they tell you that body cameras are literally being discussed right now, and some states already have body cameras, to the point of which states are still engaging and still have problems with body cameras that are because of the fact that they tell you that there is no regulation for body cameras, probably means that the state level is not sufficient for monitoring itself and for supervising itself, which is probably a unique reason as to why our contention flows through. Second of all, they completely drop our funding argument where we tell you from the Obama example that deficit spending is unique to the federal government passing this plan because they're going to be able to add more funding in order to actually mandate this from happening. To the point of which the key flaw with the affirmative plan is that there is no regulation and that they concede the fact that there's less funding in the status quo, which is the unique reason as to why there's no regulation. That means that this funding is required for there to be any solvency in today's debate, and that's why the negation is ahead on this key question. I'll take it after I respond to this contention. The second thing that they tell you is that approval ratings are higher, so there's less backlash when this is going to be passed at the state level. Look to the fact that this is completely outweighed because this undermines this, this analysis pretty much undermines the fact that states will be mad at each other, which is probably going to be more important because state unity outweighs. And I'll go on to this more when I go on to the second contention. The third thing that they say here is that there's a higher chance that it would be repealed at the federal level. Judge, number one, if we fiat that this will happen, look to the fact that our precedent argument will completely outweigh. To the point of which when the federal court did not rule in favor of this, did not rule in favor of the First Amendment, which is literally why there's no reform that's able to pass. The only way that we can have solvency is by overturning this at the federal level, and the only way that we can have any solvency is by federal things. Are we just going to keep on trying to throw darts at the state level when we see that nothing is happening? Or are we actually going to access the higher level impact or the higher level link chain at the federal level, which they concede and which Selena brings up? The fourth argument that they give you is that there's more media attention. Judge, what's better, discourse or suppression? At the federal level, you have discourse about the topic, but at the state level, to the point in which we don't even know if this policy is going to be able to pass, to the point in which we don't even know, like even if you fiat that the policy is going to pass, to the point in which we don't even know if the policy is even going to be regulated at the individual level, to the point of which corruption is probably going to be able to bypass state level laws more easily than federal level laws. That means that it's more important that you have discourse about the topic in of itself rather than suppression, rather than the policy not pass in the first place. Look to the fact that like this corruption argument completely outweighs. And second of all, backlash is always going to be non-unique, and there's always going to be more backlash than the affirmative plan when the states are all fighting with each other, especially at a time in which we're so partisan in the USFG. The fifth argument they bring here is that departments aren't run internationally. No, but the funding is the major thing that can still be controlled at the federal level, and to the point at which they concede once again that funding is required for any state level legislation to even work in the first place. That means that the negation case simply comes first. The sixth argument that they give here is that the federal government would not be able to overturn because they wouldn't have support when the affirmative plan passes. Okay, I'll take your POI now.
I'm just confused. Can you re-explain this funding argument? What funding is necessary to ban something?
Sure. So if you go to our Obama example, we tell you that deficit spending is something that uniquely comes when federal bills have been passed because the federal government is able to support these and regulate these. State governments simply do not have the ability to deficit spend. One, because they simply can't do it, and second of all, because they don't have as large budgets as the USFG. But let's continue. Their sixth argument here is that the federal government wouldn't be able to overturn this, and that basically the federal government wouldn't work. Number one, we guarantee that it wouldn't work in the affirmative plan because the affirmative plan would not work because it's not working in the status quo. Their own argument about body cameras literally turns against them. To this point, you're going to be voting negation simply out of the chance of solvency, to the point in which we've seen and tried that the affirmative plan does not work. Second of all, what's more probable? One thing being passed at the federal level or 450 bills being passed at the state level that aren't even going through right now, to the point in which we literally give you evidence that when a federal bill passes, states do confirm, and that's how all legislation is shaped afterwards. And third of all, look to the fact that we can simply fiat that the federal government will actually pass this plan, which also cross-applies to their entire Trump analysis. But fourth of all, a lot of police unions are actually national and not at the federal level. Okay, so we're clearly winning on this argument because we tell you, the underview here is that we tell you that supervision and funding is required, and to the point in which they don't respond to the empirics, to the evidence, to the point in which the status quo is bad, we're winning this argument, and we're ahead on some key questions in today's debate. Let's move on to the second contention about state partnerships. Their first argument is on gut check, and they say that there's a 30% approval rating. Number one, Judge, the effectiveness of the plan is a precursor to the support that that plan garners. To the point in which our plan is going to be more effective, our plan is simply going to gain more support. And they concede the fact that our impacts take higher precedent. Our link chain is higher because it's occupied at the federal level, because the federal level can better mandate, which means that there's always going to be better approval when there's greater success. Second of all, the argument that states fighting amongst each other is probably going to be a larger, more of a harm as compared to like there being some backlash, even if you buy the affirmative plan. That means that we're simply outweighing this argument. Then there's a statistic about how federal opinion about public opinion about the federal government and the state level doesn't apply here because it's different for every single policy. Their second argument here is that Trump will backlash. Three responses here. Number one, Biden is literally leading in every single major poll in all swing states right now after the presidential debate. Second of all, look at the fact that Trump is just not going to do this because it's going to take away too much of his political capital, and that means that he's not going to do something controversial that's pretty much going to make sure that he's not going to win the moderate vote or he's not going to win the centrist vote after he does this. And third of all, backlash is always going to be non-unique. Then they tell you that the affirmative plan has a higher chance of passing because it will effectively pass. Judge, sure, they fiat that their plan will pass, but to the point of which their plan passing on body cameras doesn't actually work and hasn't worked right now, what is the chance that it will work in the future? Additionally, going back, there's a statistic about public opinion, as I mentioned, on the federal and state level doesn't apply here because it's different for every single policy, and it's going to be different for this policy out as well. To this extent, the precedent that we bring you simply outweighs to the point at which the federal mandate is going to be have to followed, and to the point at which effectiveness is the precursor of support. We're clearly ahead on this contention. Let's move on to the first advantage. Basically, what they tell you here is it's always going to be less polarized at local levels. First of all, crossed by all the responses that I've already made. But second of all, look at the fact that you're clearly going to be turning this because, as I stated, none of the reform has passed yet. What's more likely, that 450 bills will be able to pass smoothly without corruption, or as one universal bill will be able to pass at the federal level, which we fiat and tell you has pretty much 100% probability of happening? The precedent simply outweighs your Judge. Don't let them come up and say that they're winning on this. Then look to the fact that having more bills passing is literally counterintuitive because it means that you have to mandate that all these bills in all 50 states are literally working when they aren't by the status quo and we only need one. Then they tell you that they're winning on body cameras. Judge, the reason that loopholes can be found at the state level, literally in these areas that have implemented body cameras, as they say, is a warrant to the fact that it doesn't solve at the local level and that we need to have a federal level solvency. To the point at which they quote that states are solving, why are there still problems in the status quo? Which means that we're not only ahead on the negations arguments, we're also winning because of the key turns to the affirmative case, protected time, sorry. Which means that, Judge, at the end of the day, you're going to be voting for the negation simply because not only does our precedent outweigh, but our arguments just make more logical sense and we're operating at the higher level link chain. For these and many more, I strongly urge a negation ballot, and I strongly believe that the negation is ahead on a bunch of key questions in today's debate. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to go straight into voter issues. Let me know in the chat if my audio is still bad, but I'll just try to turn my audio towards the camera. Okay. My time starts now. The negation is going to be winning today's debate for two main reasons. Number one, because we solve for the problem of police brutality better than the affirmative. And number two, because with less backlash, we're getting more discourse and ensures that the plan will stay. Let's look to the first topic, which is solvency. So on their responses, they talk about how the federal action is much easier to overturn. Extend my partner's response that we literally give you this precedent. Don't let them come up here in the last speech and tell you that the Citizens United and Federal Election Commission Supreme Court case doesn't hold up because it's unions, not corporations. It's still the same topic of funding for political campaigns and restricting those rights. So it's still the same topic, which means there's a really, really strong federal precedent already, which means we really need a federal action right now as a sustainable method in order to overturn this federal precedent set before, which means because we are the only side that actually overturns this precedent and ensures that the plan is able to actually be implemented and solved, we're going to be winning the precedent argument. In addition, they also drop our argument that we need the power of deficit spending in the government, and that's unique to solving. Don't let them come up here in their last speech and refute that because it was dropped in all the other speeches. The problem is that you don't need money to ban it, but you need money to enforce the policy. Enforcing the policy is going to be key here. You probably need legal fees as like a consequence of trying to like litigate against people who like don't follow the rule. You probably need to travel. There's a lot of fees that go into any kind of policy, which means when the affirmation doesn't have the power of like funding and investment backed behind the enforcement, we're going to be the side that actually solves better and can ensure that it's 100% effective. And number three, on the point of solvency, is key here is of state polarization. So don't let them come up here in their last speech and talk about how police departments are not run nationally and local police departments need to like enforce this. Police unions are nationally. The topic says police unions. Look to the fact that they state themselves that Trump is backed by the largest national union. National unions are what like are affecting the results of the election, which means we need national reform, federal reform in order to check back against these national unions, which means our plan solves better. In addition, there's going to be a lot more discrepancy because of state polarization. Look to the fact that Republican states or like partisan states are more likely to like find loopholes with the policy and have it like more biased and implement it differently than other like Democratic or other politically leaning states, which means no matter what in their world, because of state discrepancies, there's going to be like more ineffectiveness and it's not going to be as helpful. Okay, now let's go on to impact weighing for solvency. We're going to be winning on the long term because we enforce state unity. On the point of second voter issue of backlash, they talk about how they bring up this statistic that says 28% approval rating for federal, 58% for local. Extend my partner's analysis about how this isn't accurate in the form of today's debate because it's about the federal government in general. It's not about a specific policy, which means like how controversial police brutality is right now. It's still going to be controversial and it's still going to incite backlash against white supremacist groups in this, no matter if the state passes it or if the federal government passes it. So backlash is still going to be in both worlds. But secondly, even if you believe that our side is going to have even more backlash, we actually turn this because we say that media intention is actually even better. With like federal action, this sends a precedent to other countries by enacting it with just 50 states. This doesn't increase US soft power and hegemony because it's not as big of a perceptual signal to other countries, which means we actually have discourse about the topic and ensure that it can stay for the long term. Look at the fact that my partner clearly tells you that would you rather have discourse or suppression, Judge? If we have the 50 states pass the plan, there's going to be suppression. There's going to be Republican states that find loopholes that make the policy not effective, and there's going to be a lot of discrepancies that prohibit policies from passing in the future. In our world, we have solvency in the long term because we're benefiting more people by having this really big US perception, benefiting and winning on net benefits as well. Thank you, and for all these reasons, I urge a strong negation ballot.
Okay, so my order is going to be kind of pretty overviewy, so I would probably flow it on a separate sheet, kind of just going through the main points of clash in today's debate and then doing some impact calculus at the end. Is everyone ready? All right, 5 minutes. Starting my time now. What it comes down to in today's debate is police reform, which is by a long shot the most important impact in today's debate because it is the most probable and the highest magnitude impact. Why is it the most probable impact? Because we know that police brutality is occurring all across the country. And we know that hundreds of reforms are on the line currently, and I'm sure the negation agrees that this is the most important impact at the point in which the only bad things that they have to say about the plan is that the actor is bad and not the plan itself. So let's get into their offensive claims. First on funding. They tell you that there are all these legal fees needed to enforce legislation, but at the end of the day, their funding arguments make virtually no sense. This isn't a valid argument, and you should not evaluate it because state budgets account for law enforcement. Simply because you pass a new law does not mean that all of a sudden law enforcement funding ceases to exist. But even if you don't buy that,
so the argument against, the refute against our funding argument that states have their own funding to like fund local police departments is new and could have been brought up in the second speech.
Yeah, I'm bringing it up now because until I POI'd in the MO, the funding link was super unclear for me. So this is like our first chance to understand the specific articulation that this funding is legal fees and whatnot, things that were specified out of the neg block.
Up to judges.
But judges' discretion. All right, does anyone know how much time I have left?
There's 4 minutes and 10 seconds.
Okay. 1 second. All right. I'm going to move on from that anyways, but up to the judges. With that, I will be restarting my time now. But even if you don't buy that, it doesn't matter because states can change their budget and we get out of the neg block that states cannot deficit spend. If you look up the state debt, it is $1.3 trillion. They can deficit spend and they do, meaning that none of these arguments are valid. So now let's talk about this Citizens United argument. This is entirely unrelated to police unions because the Citizens United decision was specific to corporations, like Gracia tells you, and these unions simply do not.
Point of order, time stop. The argumentation that the Citizens United decision specifically does not cross-apply to our warrants that we read could have been brought up in DMG.
I heard it in Gracia's speech. I'm fine with it. I don't know if other judges have a different opinion.
Judge's discretion. How much time do I have left? Sorry, I keep on pausing it way too late.
3 minutes and 40 seconds.
Okay, sorry. One sec. That means that you simply cannot vote there because this entire, like the link story, even if you don't buy all of our analysis, the link story is simply not clear enough and therefore not probable enough for you to give them access to any of these impacts on this disadvantage. So now their only remaining offense in the round is basically that this needs to occur at a federal level because for some reason enforcement is going to be better. I want to make a couple key extensions that they concede. They concede Gracia's analysis that law enforcement happens at these state and local levels, meaning that state and local legislatures are uniquely key to being able to enforce things that occur in municipalities and like actual areas designated at a state and local level where law enforcement are active. This is not a national force, and you should extend that across, meaning that we are better able to solve for the loopholes that they identify, but also there is this really clear story that carries throughout the entire round that they simply do not do enough work on. We tell you that 58% of Americans have a positive view of their state legislature. We tell you that 28%, as opposed to that, have a positive view of their federal legislature. Why is this important? This is important because when a federal law is passed, we see what our opponents refer to as discourse. But the problem with that is that a lot of the discourse that comes out of the Republican Party lately is very bad. All it took was one single Trump tweet to hatch a kidnapping plot. We know that these white supremacist groups are active in violent ways, and we know that any discourse, any backlash from Trump risks violent impacts occurring. So let me clarify this story here. What we see is that when this passes at a federal level, not only are Americans already and constituents already more likely to be displeased with their federal government, but this gets a lot more news coverage. And when this gets a lot more news coverage, Donald Trump lashes out. They tell you that none of this matters because Biden is leading. I have a few responses. First of all, so is Hillary. Hillary was leading in all the polls. Second of all, we know that the Republicans are actively trying to steal the election through a bunch of different things relating to absentee ballots. We also know Russia's interfering again. We cannot trust these polls. But third of all, Trump literally won't commit to a peaceful transition of power. But fourth of all, it literally doesn't matter because one Trump tweet, anything that is seen in the status quo to go against Donald Trump can pull out his phone, tweet something, and cause violence, meaning that they automatically trigger protests. They automatically trigger higher rates of backlash. Their only real response here is states are going to backlash against each other. How does that work? This link story is simply not clarified, but we can give you a 100% probability that if Congress passes legislation that Donald Trump is openly against, he will say something. And when he says something, or the media will say something, and when the media says something, these Republicans, these white supremacist groups that are active in the status quo, that are violently protesting, are going to be more likely to go out and violently protest and do all these terrible things that we see them doing in the status quo. And that automatically turns all of the remaining impacts about the perception of the United States, because it simply does not look good when white supremacists are out in the streets committing violent crimes, which is likely what we see in a world where Donald Trump gets upset at legislation being passed by the federal government. But not only that, these states are in a uniquely better position to enforce laws that occur at a state and local level, meaning that we automatically win there. But then there's also really key conceded analysis that says that state laws are repealed at lower rates, whereas federal laws are repealed and amended at significantly higher rates. You can extend this across your flow, and what this means is that we are likely to access more long-term, more probable impacts, and therefore we win on the highest magnitude impacts in today's round.